To give some insight into what you just heard, and into the general tone of the campaign as we enter the final stretch, I'm joined now by Frank Rich, whose columns appear each Sunday in the New York Times, and who is also the author of The Greatest Story Ever Sold. Frank Rich, welcome.
Thank you.
Something you've written about recently is how over the past couple of weeks there's been this discernible change in the tone of the campaign. And it's something that's particularly been conspicuous in this anger expressed by some people attending McCain and Palin rallies, where several supporters have shouted things like terrorist, Arab, communist, socialist, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have even shouted, kill him. Even just a couple of days ago, the Washington Times, of all publications, reported that some McCain supporters in North Carolina were actually heckling people heading into the polls to vote early in that state. What's really going on here? Is this a trend, or are these sort of isolated incidents going on around the country?
Well, I think what was for a while a trend, I think it's begun to subside, was that the McCain campaign, particularly but not exclusively Sarah Palin, was dealing with very incendiary rhetoric that goes beyond usual sort of tough negative campaigning. You know, it's one thing to accuse Obama of guilt by association, such as it was with William Ayers, who had been a radical and a member of the Weather Underground in the 1960s when Obama was a child. You know, it's one thing to call him a left-winger or try to make him look like a radical if they want to do it, even if it's not true. But when you start saying, as Palin did, that a candidate is palling around with terrorists, and she used the plural, you're implying that he is part of a criminal attempt, essentially, to bring terror, and which means, in most people's minds, post 9/11, mass death to Americans. Furthermore, when you do it at rallies where a introductory speaker bandies about Obama's middle name, Hussein, as if to imply that has some meaning in this context, you create a picture that, in my own view, potentially could cause some people to want to take the law into their own hands. It seemed to be the point. And so when you saw the rhetoric of the people in the audience step up and say things like terrorist or kill him, and the McCain campaign initially do nothing about it, even if they didn't hear it immediately, although in some cases clearly they did, and just remain silent and let it burn, you're really playing with fire. I think that after, not there's a cause effect, but shortly after I wrote about it, John Lewis, the congressman, spoke out about it. Other people spoke out about it, and they started dialing it back. They, meaning the McCain campaign, and we haven't heard that language so much anymore, and that's a good thing. On the other hand, this is the first African-American candidate who's gotten this far on the road to the presidency in our country, and I think it was really reprehensible what they did, and scary. I also think in the end, at least as things stand now, it did them more damage than anyone else, because it seems that this period of intense negativity and sort of flying off the handle has corresponded with the beginning of another drop in McCain's poll numbers.
As you point out, they've sort of publicly toned it down, at least on the stump. But I'm curious what you make of a number of recent robocalls that have gone out, one of which is suggesting that Obama's worked closely with domestic terrorist Bill Ayers, which eventually gets to implying that he was assisting this guy who killed Americans. And then this other one that actually came out a couple days ago in Virginia that it begins, Barack Obama and his fellow Democrats aren't who you think they are. Are these things still sort of more of a subterranean?
Oh, absolutely. And what's really fascinating, too, is that some of the personnel involved are the very people who worked for George Bush in 2000 to bring down John McCain during the Republican primary process with rumors of a similarly scurvy sort about McCain and his family. So the ultimate hypocrisy here, besides the fact that it's ugly, is that McCain is trying to use this subterranean stuff against Obama, the same exact campaign tactics that brought McCain down and that he decried 8 years ago. I also think it's not just the terrorist part of it and the Bill Ayers part of it, but there's definitely a racial tinge to much of it, and it gives license to McCain supporters to do things like heckle voters, as you mentioned, and heckle African American voters in the South. And I think this whole Real America rhetoric that started to emerge after the palling around with terrorist rhetoric is very much has a racial implication. It's the small town Real America, which sort of means what? Well, Wasilla, Alaska, which is essentially an all-white town. That seems to be what's going on here, and it's, in my opinion, it's revolting. But anyway, that's just my opinion.
Of course. And finally, I mean, this is really, I think, almost the lingering question from all of this. I'm struck by the fact that even if the McCain folks tone it down, the campaign will end in a couple of weeks. A lot of these people are pretty angry, and they seem sort of whipped up into this fervor. Where does all this anger go after November 4th, particularly if Obama ends up winning the election and McCain does not? What happens with all these upset, angry people?
Well, we don't know. As you may recall, as I'm sure you do recall, and there was a whole group of people who, for another set of reasons, although it may have been some of the same crowd, in 1993 decided Bill Clinton was not a legitimate president, and it led to a lot of stuff that in retrospect seems over the top in terms of scandal mongering and distraction for the country. I guess we'll see if Obama wins, we'll see some of that anger play out, and we don't know how. It's a matter of concern given how violent some of the rhetoric was at various points in the McCain campaign, and so I can't really predict that. I would hope that cooler heads would prevail, including in the Republican Party, which might exercise a little bit of leadership. This is essentially an all-white party. It's driven away black voters. It's driven away a lot of Hispanic voters that were with the Republican Party as recently as in the 2004 Bush-Kerry election. And they're going to have to reach out. There's going to have to be some adults in the Republican Party. Who those adults are, I don't know, because it's essentially a party that if it does lose the White House, really won't have a leader, because they had a very weak presidential field, which is part of what allowed McCain to prevail in the first place. It wasn't a terribly popular figure even within his own party. And if he loses, and Sarah Palin fades back to Alaska, should he lose, and there's also a rout in the Senate and the House, it's a mess. And a lot of onus is going to be on Republicans to try to get their house in order and help do the best things for America as this country faces a very, very rough time for the reasons we all know, and needs to have, doesn't mean it has to have lockstep agreement with a potential Obama administration, but it does mean we have to return to some kind of civility that is going to allow governance that will help us get out of this national mess we're in.
Well, we'll all be certainly watching. And Frank Rich, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.